Going live. Hey, everybody. John Sviokla here with my dear friend John Macomber. Today, we're going to get a chance to talk about healthy buildings and smart cities, uh, and really kind of John does amazing work at Harvard Business School, where he teaches many things, and importantly, how to think about financing projects and capabilities that would allow us to mitigate some of the challenges of climate change. Let me give you a little bit of background on John. I had a chance to first meet him at Harvard College. Sorry, not Harvard College, at Harvard Business School. We were both together. And then when I was on the faculty there, I was writing cases on expert systems and so forth. And John had just taken over the family business, the George B.H. Macomber Company. And John was trying to figure out, can I use an expert system or some kind of computer decision support to help do estimating, which, as you know, is an incredibly complicated problem. So we got to know each other there. And then later on, John started a company called Collaborative Structures, which was trying to create an information platform and transparency in the construction business, which ain't easy. And as John and I were just talking about, it's the right idea. It was just 30 years before its time. So the right idea 30 years before its time financially is a failure. So, but John learned a lot in there. And he's an incredible teacher, dear friend, and probably one of the people in the world I've known to really tolerate baloney, like not at all, and cuts through to the facts. And I was delighted to have him today because the work he's doing in that same spirit of being a true practical person and truly a humanist, a person who cares about people and the environment and so forth, is trying to come up with that middle ground between doing nothing and wringing your hands about the stuff that's out of our control. And given his perch at Harvard Business School, there's a lot of talent and money that flows through that place and around it. And it's really doing some fantastic work and trying to think about how do you package, measure, relate to structure, things that could actually make a difference. So, John, as always, man, it's great to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. So let me just take folks through a quick notion of sorry, let's see, that's the last slide, which we'll share with you at the end, but our next guest. But first, to take you through our agenda, we're going to talk about what's going on with urbanization and with some of the challenges of climate change in the context of that urbanization. And then we're also going to talk about what healthy buildings are and how to think about it. Cover some of John's thoughts on what resilient or smart cities might look like and how we might get there in the context of public and private partnerships. All of those are rich topics. And as always, anyone who's in the audience, if you would just put your commentary in the chat, I will try to splice it into our conversation, answer your questions and so forth. So please feel free to do that. And of course, we're recording this so it'll be available to folks later. But John, first, John, how'd you kind of get into this whole notion of worrying about healthy buildings and financing and structuring and so forth, the kind of stuff that you do and teach and research at HBS and spread around the world?
It was kind of a question of how to use the skills that I had developed over years to try and address some major problems. When I first came to Harvard Business School, I came to teach real estate, real property, real estate 101, how do you build and flip an office building, which is interesting, but there's nothing new really academically being discovered there.
Sure.
And we started doing executive programs elsewhere in the world. In particular, we did 3 real estate programs in India. It became quite apparent that you couldn't just drop a building down and expect to also get roads, bridges, water, power, waste, all these things that are assumed in the developed world. So infrastructure was important, both to developers and infrastructure people are involved in property. The other thing that was really hard to miss in India is the poverty, in thinking, how can we use some of these tools we know to address it? Then I started hanging out with the business and environment people at Harvard Business School. I'm not qualified to talk about parts per million of carbon. I'm not qualified to talk about the Paris Accords. I am qualified to talk about steel, dirt, concrete. How do you get capital into roads, bridges, water, power, transit, the kind of things that can use private capital and private development skills to bring public benefit, um, to both to make money, but also to serve a lot of people. So that's how the interest evolved.
Gotcha. And so, did you, on the back of that, did you design a course? Did you start doing research? I mean, how did you move forward?
A little bit of both. My research is different than a lot of the academic research because I don't have a PhD. I don't have the skills to do panelized regressions on big data sets looking for an anomaly in some derivative swap to publish in a journal. But I do like to travel and talk to people out in the world and wear
Sure.
a hard hat and go to construction sites. Or I've taken multiple people to solid waste facilities with household trash because it's a big issue. Not everybody thinks about that. So that's what my research looks like, is sort of thinking how to piece those things together, including travel trips with students looking at pairwise comparisons of cities in Latin America or in Africa,
Mm-hmm.
thinking where private capital and development might be able to be mobilized towards, say, mass transit or more density in housing or to renewable energy, those kind of things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know one big part of your work is the whole notion of how do you create a healthy building, and your book and healthy buildings, how indoor spaces drive performance and productivity. What's the core argument underneath that, John? What do executives need to understand from that?
So the Healthy Buildings was a book that I co-wrote with a colleague from the Chan School of Public Health
Sure.
at Harvard, who's an indoor air quality person, industrial hygienist. And we wrote it at the building scale, not the sort of urban scale.
Right.
And really what we were addressing was um, how we thought that investments in various aspects of buildings were a little bit misguided, notably that the everybody's all excited about saving energy,
Yes.
which is important, but sometimes that's at a sacrifice of people's performance and indoor air quality, and particularly cognition. So the important study that my colleague, Dr. Joseph Allen, did was called the CogFX study. And it was a double-blind experiment in which volunteers did their office work in a setting where the researchers changed over the course of days the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, the amount of
Mm-hmm.
particulates, the amount of volatile organic compounds.
Mm-hmm.
And periodically during the day, the researchers measured cognition, memory, strategy,
Mm.
dealing with stress. And every single individual, every one, had really measurable, statistically significant declines in the presence of more carbon dioxide and more particulates.
Sure.
But the way you get less carbon dioxide is to run your building better. That uses energy unless the building is designed particularly carefully. So you have this sort of conundrum in the corporate world or even in the academic world. There's one person in one department who's getting a pat on the back for saving pennies on energy, and
Yes.
somewhere else we're losing dollars or tens of dollars or thousands of dollars by having people get sick or not do their best or not perform well. And of
Sure.
course, that was pre-COVID. So the premise pre-COVID was investing in a healthy building um, has real economic benefits, both
Mm-hmm.
in top line productivity. Like if you're not
Sure.
that sleepy, you can do one more interview or one more sales call, write one more article, process one more claim. And also, of course, on the cost side, it's been known for years about preventing sickouts and having fewer people leave companies. So I did the numbers part, the math, the real estate math part, and Joe did the public health part.
That's so fascinating. I remember one time I was doing some teaching in the Netherlands at the University of Nederhoden, and as I'm sure you know better than I, they have the regulations about how many lumens of natural light need to be on every desk. And I was meeting my colleague Ramona Callahan at the student center, and it wasn't quite open yet. It was an early morning thing, and it had the most beautiful effect of all these tunnels of light coming down through because it had been built post the regulations, and it's just spectacular. Complicated, I'm sure, from a design and builds perspective, but just an amazing result like that.
The aha for me was the empirical evidence around performance and productivity, because we all know anecdotally they were sleepy in a conference room or sleepy in a plane when the air is
Sure.
not moving. But to have this shown that clearly and that statistically significantly is something that even before COVID, a number of universities, hospitals, landlords were thinking about. And if you think about it anecdotally, well, you don't have this experience, John, but your listeners who've been to casinos, the
Yep.
air is always great on the gaming floor in a casino because they want you in there playing. So
Yeah, sure.
Caesars and MGM and Wind have known this for decades.
Yeah.
So it kind of plays out that way.
Yeah, pipes oxygen. It was funny. I was recently in a Native American casino, and it's a long story, but uh, I got dropped off at the old end, and it was late at night. It was like at midnight, and I walked through the old end, which smelled all like it was basically cigarettes. The cigarette and beer smell decreased as you walk from the old end to the new end. So yeah, it's interesting. In terms of when you think about healthy buildings and so forth, it seems like you've kind of gone to more healthy cities or healthy environments as you think about mitigation and so forth. Just you and I talked a little bit about what are some of the big challenges, because I was as in our conversations I was talking to you about climate rise and so forth. Being originally from Massachusetts, living here in Chicago, I've always been around water, worried about that stuff. And you said to me, look, long before the seas rise, we have another issue around heat. So what are the big issues that you're seeing, and what are the kinds of things that people are doing about it?
Well, this is an extension of what Joe Allen and I wrote about in buildings, and we tried to scale it up.
Sure.
In a moment, maybe you can ask me about COVID and healthy buildings, but I'll answer the direct question first.
No, we can go to COVID and healthy buildings. We'll come back. I won't forget. We can come back to this. So
Okay.
let's go to COVID and healthy buildings.
So as it happened, our book about healthy buildings dropped in March of 2020. So we didn't plan it. And from a book marketing point of view, this is a great thing. From a humanity point of view, it's terrible to have this scourge upon the planet.
Sure.
But it turns out that COVID is spread through aerosols that just hang in the air. It's not spread through droplets or through fomites that you have to wash your hands. And so the techniques that keep a building, to keep the building's air turning and carbon dioxide down and so forth are the same ones you use to mitigate against the spread of COVID. And we can't measure COVID in the air, but it turns out that particulates and CO2 is a really good proxy for how well this space is ventilated. So Dr. Allen and other researchers went on to talk about how air moves in different spaces, high ceilings, low ceilings, things like this.
Yes.
And we've done a lot of work with hospitals and schools and, of course, businesses and cruise ships about how can we reopen. And then going forward post-COVID, I mean, I don't think there's any such thing really as post-COVID, but clearly
Sure.
the world has gotten over the first 2 or 3 phases of it. We don't think this awareness of health is going to go away. People will always remember what happened.
Yes.
They'll be thinking about
Sure.
this. And there's no doubt empirically in the world that universities, colleges, health clubs, restaurants, landlords, cruise ships, hotels are clearly competing on, okay, how healthy is our space? What do we do? Both from a point of view of health theater, where they have people in white gloves wiping stuff down very visibly in front of you, and also in terms of real action, where you can see that the air is being changed out faster or the windows are opened, and they go ahead and use a little bit more energy, even as energy is expensive, to keep the buildings healthier, because that's fundamentally what you do is open the windows and run the fans, unless you're in an environment where the outdoor air is poor, which leads into the next question.
Gotcha. Hey, John, just a point of fact. What's the difference between a droplet and an aerosol? Because I assume they were the same.
The weight. So droplets fall. So that's the 6-foot idea, which isn't, it turns out doesn't really prove out that 6 feet is any more important than 4 feet or 10 feet. But the thought is that droplets eventually fall like a sneeze has droplets.
I see.
And then when it lands, now it's a fomite. It's on a surface. So remember when 2 years ago people were wiping down their mail and wiping down their groceries? I mean,
Yes.
that's a lot of diseases, cold and flu, are spread by what you touch. But the aerosols stay up in the air. They're light. Think of smoke. So if you think about how if there's a smoker on the other side of the room, you can smell that smoker.
Sure.
If the room's not well ventilated, the COVID particles move in that with their light, and they go up in the drafts.
Fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, so extending that out to the environment and that kind of thinking, you got to your next set of insights.
So there were perils in addition to breathing CO2. Actually, CO2 doesn't hurt you, although there's plenty of arguments in environmental policy about whether it should be regulated or not. It's not like sulfur dioxide or something like that. But it's pretty apparent. Like, I talk to a lot of finance people and a lot of sort of skeptical types, so I don't make predictions about environment or climate or any of that, but it certainly appears anecdotally that there are increasing wildfires, increasing sea level rise, increasing river flooding, increasing drought, increasing extreme heat, sometimes in the same place. So Texas and Arizona this week had both droughts and floods. Kenya is simultaneously having droughts and floods. Turkey is simultaneously having droughts and floods. And there's extreme heat in many places, notably in China, which has had one of the highest heat waves, touching the biggest number of people in recorded history. So these are also perils that need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess if you're sort of a true climate believer, the first thing to do is decarbonize the economy and bring all the carbon out of the atmosphere and all that. And I hope that happens. And I hope our colleagues and my former senator, John Kerry, turns all that back. But if it doesn't happen, then we are going to have more sea rise, more floods, more of these perils.
Mm-hmm.
But they happen in a very uneven way. They don't happen at the same frequency in the same locations, and people have really different awareness and concerns. So if you're living in southern Louisiana, you're worried about sea rise all the time. If you're living in Napa, California, you're worried about wildfire. If you live in Ukraine, you're not worried about climate, you're worried about eating. If you live in Sudan, you're worried about eating. So the level of awareness and the level of concern varies a lot by geography. It varies a lot by what is the peril, and it varies a lot by how much money is floating around. Like I'm doing talks later this fall in Dubai and also in Nigeria. The way you address these things, the way you look at these is really different. And some of the perils are kind of slow moving, like sea level rise or extreme heat. Some are really sudden, like earthquakes or floods or rain or wildfires. They might not happen. So, you can't just spend infinite money on preparation if an event isn't even going to happen. So there's a lot of probability involved, a lot of modeling. And my interest is around how do we attract more capital towards addressing those issues, mitigating them. And the public health connection is that some of these are really bad for people.
Sure.
If there's 200 excess deaths in Phoenix in a year, like will probably happen this summer, or if there were 30 excess deaths from smoke inhalation in San Francisco, not only is this morally bad, it's also terrible business. So the idea is, how do you think about how to bring capital early in the system, track the who pays, who benefits, so that there's a way that economically makes sense for everybody to have a better outcome than the total free-for-all chaos outcome.
And so, could you say more about on the heat stuff? I forget what you call them, heat domes or whatever. They're starting to happen in different cities, Chicago, Phoenix, other places.
Well, the heat domes are an unusual event. Like usually Portland, Oregon wouldn't expect to have 4 days in a row of 110 degrees Fahrenheit heat. So those are sudden events. Chicago has had that a couple times in history. Paris has just recently had one, and had one about 15 years ago that killed thousands of people. These are unexpected. They don't happen all the time. You can't really invest against them as if you knew it was always going to be there. Whereas in a place like Phoenix or Houston or Delhi, it's going to be hot. So it's sort of a slower moving thing. And the interventions are different because they pencil in, the benefits of them pencil in differently. So we look at this in two components. One is around the slow moving ones that can be expected, like in Phoenix. How do you think about things at the city level, like that take some time, whether it's putting reflective things on streets or trees or white roofs or having more ventilation? And also, how do you think about the response? How do you organize the first responders, the fire, or even social media to just check in on people? Because a lot of the people who die in sort of slow moving heat just are older people maybe, or people who can't get around, and nobody checked on them to make sure they were drinking. The sudden ones, it's a little bit different because you don't want to have all this stuff sort of standing by and not used. So you're less likely in a Portland, Oregon situation to worry about the white roofs and plant a lot of trees, and be more worried about first responders and how will we think how to get to address these issues when they happen. So there's both the prevention piece and the response piece, and a thoughtful program balances that. And
You know,
so it's also true of floods and wildfire, but it's always a different balance. That's what's interesting to me, is how do you find that balance?
yeah, what's been, you and I both have worked with complex models before, but I think that one of the things that's been interesting to note, uh, I think people who use complex models and understand the assumption, at least at a high level, understand the assumptions and the possible variance and how small changes can make massive outcome changes. But it's been interesting to see how the narrative and the media doesn't, it makes for great news, I guess, because you can always argue both sides. But one of the things that it seems to me, at least in some parts of the modeling, in particular the ice modeling, from that guy Hansen, who was, I think, in '88, went in front of Congress and said, global warming is happening, it's anthropogenic, the whole routine, and his big thing in the last of his material I looked at was that our ice melting models are way too conservative. That the actual observed melting of ice in Greenland and Antarctica, especially Greenland, because so much of that's on land going
Yeah,
into the water.
it's not
Uh,
floating.
yeah, is have been completely too conservative, meaning that their estimates are too low compared to observed behavior. I mean, observed result. And he was saying something like we might within 50 years have 3 meters of sea rise, which I think means that Atlanta is the new Miami or something like that.
Orlando, maybe.
Orlando, yeah. Well, I think that Miami's average distance above sea level is 6 feet, right? So that's not a lot. Interesting.
With respect to the news, I have a couple comments about that. One is that the sudden events are much more interesting in the news, a big flood or a big earthquake. Whereas the
Yeah.
slow moving events, like maybe some unhoused people are ill in Phoenix, that's not in the news as much.
Yep.
So it's very difficult to get people to focus on where are the right places to invest in prevention that actually have a return on investment.
Mm-hmm.
The second is that it really varies by peril and by location. So I don't talk about sea level rise that much anymore because there's still people shouting down the fact that it's not happening or that it will reverse. But if you talk about wildfire, people say, yeah, I see that and it's really scary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's covered differently in the news. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're trying to cover to touch to all audiences, you think about different perils.
Sure.
I'm working on a case study right now about an insurance company in Turkey. And one of the big issues, in addition to earthquakes and wildfire, is hail. Um, that's also a phenomenon in the central United States. But one of the takeaways from the case is that pretty much everybody in Turkey is very aware of these added climate risks and
Mm-hmm.
thinks about what are we going to do. Even if at the federal level there's not investment, at the individual level there's quite a bit of thinking about that. Whereas in many other places, it's pretty easy to think about upcoming tennis or how bad the Red Sox are this year or what's happening in fashion and just assume you can flip a switch for your air conditioning and not worry about these issues at all. So that level of news and perception really varies a lot.
Yeah, for sure. The John, I mean, you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about sustainable cities and sustainable building, and you just mentioned the areas of opportunity where you could make investments that would make a difference and also have some return on capital. What are some of those areas that you're seeing?
Well, again, they vary by peril and they vary by role or where you are in the value chain. So I usually think about this in terms of like who are you and what do you do? What are you trying to do?
Sure.
So it depends where you sit. And for some international firms, the talent and the capital is fungible and they can look for opportunity based on the technology they hold in their hand. On the other on the flip side, if you're anchored in Jakarta or um, in Fairbanks or something, then you're going to be thinking about your location and looking at the peril. We also find that the reactions are really different between, say, an operating business, like, say, a JetBlue that has all these, or a Walmart that have big facilities near water, whether it's airplane hangars or warehouses,
Hmm.
or if you are a large portfolio owner like a city or like the federal government or like a university or
Mm-hmm.
like a healthcare system. Or if you're a pure financial investor trying to think, are there some long short plays here? Um, or if you are at sort of the second tier, which I think is quite interesting around lenders and insurers. So unless you're specifically in that space, most people don't want to think about those aspects. But
Mm-hmm.
for all the perils we talked about, if you can't get insurance, particularly property casualty insurance, then you
Yes.
can't get credit. You can't get credit, then there's no more commerce. So those second tier impacts, and some of those are sort of system level impacts. If you think about the impairment of for example, the entire Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac portfolio, those things are interesting at a system level. So the first sort of most obvious tier of things that we see are operating businesses thinking, how do we just defend our physical assets and our workforce?
Yes.
And as you read anecdotally a lot, organizations like Walmart or Lowe's or McDonald's are pretty good at keeping open.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the first ones to serve people when there are
Sure.
crises in New Orleans or other places. Um, because they have that sort of logic of thinking ahead, and we're investing and doing the math against a
Mm-hmm.
portfolio, saying if we have this warehouse that's out, it's going to cost us X number of days of lost time and Y sales, and it's cost Z amount to prepare it. So let's do the
Sure.
math and beef that up. Um, that's a little hard, and we're seeing it now kind of quietly in commercial real estate portfolios.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the big investors have some uh, uh, relationship with a climate modeling company or a rating company or both.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interesting sort of information asymmetries right now is there's a lot of climate risk modeling, but it's largely proprietary. There
Mm-hmm.
are a few entities who are trying to make it be totally public and shared, like First Street Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also companies like Moody's or Standard & Poor's that do ratings, who have acquired firms like Force 27 or Jupiter, who have proprietary climate projections. So
Mm-hmm.
this is, in the insurance industry, this is really unusual because historically the regulators have said you have to look at past experience in your life losses or property casualty losses or fire losses because they're real, and the regulators are meant to protect the ratepayers. But you're looking forward against a climate thing that might or might not happen,
Right.
that's based on proprietary information, and you don't share the data. It's
Mm-hmm.
very hard for the regulators to look at that, but also the investors essentially can make bets. Many of them is more of a long only bet. They'll say, we're only going to invest in apartment buildings that are in certain geographies or certain amounts above sea level or certain distances from the WUI, the the wild and urban interface, if they're worried about fire.
Mm-hmm.
They appear to be kind of quietly maybe divesting some assets,
Mm-hmm.
but not very loudly. So there isn't really but there are also today long short strategies in the real estate space where people are thinking, okay, something happened in the global financial crisis 14 years ago.
Right.
Maybe there's another way to figure out how to short some of these markets. But it's not like shorting a meme stock where there's short interest in the market. You have to figure
Sure.
out who's going to take the other side of the trade. So there's different levels of aggressiveness in that regard. And there are others where people say it doesn't matter. That's 5 or 10 years down the road, and I'm building my asset, and I'm going to flip it in 5, and it'll be fine.
Sure.
And uh, certainly, you would think that if you only looked at climate, that nobody ever would go to Phoenix or Miami again. Well,
Right.
it's the opposite. Phoenix is booming from a real estate point of view. Miami is booming from a real estate point of view.
Crazy. Yeah.
They're It's not necessarily crazy. People are other factors in people's lives
No, no. It's
around
the
jobs and taxation, and most of the time is lovely there.
no,
So,
no. I just meant the market is going. It was very.
crazy in general, yeah, but
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a crazy decision. And I read about
Yeah.
some things were permitted in Miami the other day, and it just happened to say in the last paragraph of the press release, and they're going to elevate the first floor, build a seawall, and there's a third piece: seawall, elevate the first floor, and there was another flood protection thing that they were doing. So
Mm-hmm.
if you have the economic tailwinds behind you like that, essentially Miami will just get raised on its own over the
Sure.
course of time.
Yeah.
That's a really attractive community. Not every place has economic tailwinds like that behind it.
Yeah, and political chops, and also, I'm reminded of when the Texas delegation voted against the uh, the uh, the Hurricane Sandy bill, federal bailout bill, but the folks in New Jersey voted for the Houston bailout bill. Subsequent to that, so I think there'll be political will to take some of the risk off as well. Will be my guess.
Or people will say that maybe the federal government's not going to ride to the rescue, and we have to look out for ourselves. So a lot of times when I teach this, I say, suppose you're investing in an asset and there was no debt and no insurance. What would you do? People make very different decisions around physical assets.
Sure.
I don't think I drive my car faster because I have car insurance. I don't think I have live more dangerously because I have life insurance. But people definitely make location decisions if they think they can insure them off, or the federal government's going to ride to the rescue. So you see very different behavior in societies where there isn't that level of financing and there isn't that level of insurance, and
Sure.
People tend to make a more cautious decision. And my sense is that the regulators aren't going to get around to doing this. It's not going to be the political consensus, but the capital sources will wind up saying, sorry, I'm not going to lend on whatever that project is that's out in the sandbar in the middle of the wildfire.
Yes. Well, as I think I still have a beach house in Marshfield, Mass, and it was founded. We're above the floodplain, supposedly. But yes, I mean, it was founded in 1640, and of course, the only people who lived down by the water were the people who had to, the fishermen and things like that, and anybody with money and time lived up in Marshfield Hills. So, to your point,
And people moved. The sea rise has gone up and down a lot during human history. It's only recently that we started to plant our assets right next to the shore.
Yeah, no, for sure. When you think about, there's so many terms of art in this area and so forth, and it reminds me of locally grown or GMO foods or whatever, right? When you think about sustainable cities, first of all, is that the right way to think about it? And what do you think of that term? What do you mean by it, if you use it?
It's a great question. My course is called Sustainable Cities and Climate Adaptation. And the first day I say, there's actually no such thing as a sustainable city. It's a buzzword. There's also no such thing as a smart city or an eco city, in my view. That's a holistic thing that's sort of descended, fully built, like electric vehicle or a pregnant person. That's one way or the other. There's no such thing as sustainable. But there are components of sustainability, components of eco, components of resilience, components of smartness. Much better way to look at it. I think of sustainability in a pretty simple sense, like what's the ability of, how do you think of using fewer resources, thinking with a long view in mind? How do you think about an economic setup that's sustainable or enduring? How do you think about governance that's also sustainable and enduring? These are sort of multiple pieces that were thought about in terms of sustainability. For me, I look mostly at the hard infrastructure. Not that governance and the soft infrastructure is not important, but I'm a finance professor, and that people can invest in roads, bridges, water, power plants at the city scale. They don't really know how to invest in governance necessarily, or in some of the soft issues that need to come along. So what's interesting to me is around how you can measure the benefit and the investment in something like public transportation or a faster road or a better water system. Because infrastructure tends to, so I think about it from an infrastructure lens, because we need we need atoms, roads and steel, and we have to move water around in order to get what we really want, which is jobs and housing and education and these kind of things. But you need to have the underlayment below that. So I'm always looking at where's the investment case for spending more money up front for something that's essentially going to have a lower total life cycle cost, usually because of operating expenses or because of better resistance to stress.
Sure.
The difficulty with infrastructure is that the investment is very large up front and very focused by whoever that investor is, whether it's a private company or the government. But the benefits are very long term, 20, 30, 50 years, and they're very diffuse. So it's hard to collect the benefits just on the tariff from a road or water or transit, because they're very diffuse. That's why, in the sort of academic world, the government should be building infrastructure. That's what they do. But in the real world, that's not happening. So then what's interesting to me is how do you track those diffuse benefits, either non-quantifiable ones or quantify them, figure out some way to measure them, some way to get
Sure.
paid for them, some way to think of why is the new case better than the old case was going to be, some kind of benchmarking. And that's what attracts capital, and that's what also gets citizens interested and gets governments interested in doing it as well, so that you think of these benefits for the common good.
Sure. So I know you've given a lot of thought to what are some of the ways and some of those investments that, and I understand it varies by location, role, and what'd you say? Not risk.
What's the peril?
Hazard. Peril.
Hazard. Yeah.
Yeah. The What are some of those things that you think are smart investments in terms of increasing the resilience of? And feel free to pick a city or location or whatever.
Sure. I'll start with some sort of physical ones, and I'll move into some that they're more appealing to like tech entrepreneur types.
Sure.
So there are definitely businesses now around the world and also in the U.S. that do things like, we will come to your building in California and do seismic retrofit for you, and the amount that you save in insurance is going to benefit will pay for what we did, or we'll even finance it ourselves, like people used to do energy efficiency investing a while ago. I'm working with two different people now who are in the business of elevating homes. So you can pick up homes and beef up the foundation. It's an interesting thing because some homes it's really easy to do, some it's hard, but also you don't necessarily want to be the only elevated home in your neighborhood. If the rest of your neighborhood is destroyed, that's not so great. And then if you have a historic home or Art Deco home, why do you want to have 6 steps coming up? But
Sure.
there are clearly instances where the communities have enough value that it's worth elevating the homes and keeping them higher. So it's actually more challenging in places like Charleston, South Carolina, or Miami Beach, where they're so historic and they have floods all the time, but you have these real issues with the level. Anyway, there's businesses that do that, and I think there's going to wind up being franchised equipment that does this, and franchise operators that have a national footprint, national name, national qualification, and are able to mobilize all the people you need to elevate a house. And not too many of your viewers probably care about this, but you have to pick it up, you have to dig, you have to do foundations, you have to do electrical, you have to do plumbing, you have to do carpentry. So there's all these trades, so it can take 6 months to elevate a house.
Yes.
If you could do that in 2 months with less price uncertainty, that would be very valuable. And if you could select which houses are appropriate and not just try and do anything. So that's like all your early stage entrepreneurial companies want to take any deal they can get, but actually you got to focus on the deals that are going to build your book and your expertise.
Sure.
So there are companies like that. Then there are companies that are selling them the tools. And some of the places where I think there's the most opportunity in tools is, as in every other industry, around sensors and analytics. So in the sensors realm, in our book about healthy buildings, we wrote about handheld air quality monitors. It used to be that 5 or 10 years ago, if you wanted to know indoor air quality, the owner of the building or the provost of the university or the head of the hospital will call a hygienist. They come out with white suits and beakers, and they measure one day, one piece of air in one corridor, go off and come back with the results, and the results are secret. Well, now, if you look, while people are looking right now on eBay or Amazon, you can buy 100 different high quality personal air quality monitors. And you can walk in to an apartment you might be going to buy, or into a school your child might be going to attend, or your child's 5th grade classroom, and see what the level of CO2 is, what the particulates are. This democratizes that information and puts it right in the hand of people, say high-end knowledge workers. Suppose that a venture capital firm, a private equity firm is trying to attract the best and the brightest, or a tech firm, or where I live in Moderna or Pfizer are trying to attract the best. These people walk in with air quality monitors. So this changes the dynamic. These things also can be tied to the cloud, so that there's the ability to do analytics on the air quality in buildings. And there are entities right now that do this with outdoor air quality. There's an entity called Purple Air that's based on the West Coast that has individual citizen air quality monitor tracking, and they are better at knowing where these clouds of soot from wildfires are going than what you
Mm-hmm.
get from the satellites. So how will that information eventually be assembled? How will it be tracked? How will it be used? And how will people anticipate where
Sure.
this will go? I think there's a huge opportunity there. Similarly, if you're thinking about flooding or sea rise, the
Mm-hmm.
ability, a lot of the flooding happens because the drainage is poor. Why is the drainage poor? Because some of the things are blocked up. Can we find out they're blocked up and free them? Yes, we can. So
Right.
you'd be able to mitigate a lot of those costs. I talked about the wildfire earlier and the people who are alone, who aren't being, I mean, the extreme heat, the people who are alone and nobody's checking on them.
Yes.
The ability to have to read their Fitbit information and see what their pulse is and what their
Sure.
blood oxygenation is and what their skin temperature is, and go out and intervene um, in a way that doesn't impinge on privacy, in a way that's reimbursed by an insurance company. That's all a question of what's the baseline, what's the better result, what do we think is going to happen, how do we prioritize. So those sensors and analytics things to me feel like they're opportunities that will be very large as you think about almost everybody in the global population having some exposure either directly to these hazards or indirectly. Like even if you live, in a pristine mountaintop with lots of water, if you happen to have money in mutual in a bond fund that has holdings in municipal bonds from cities that are getting flooded, your portfolio is at risk in a way that you didn't think you were personally at risk. So these all flow through.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. The one of the themes that we talk a lot about in this growth innovator series is this notion of computability. That is, the level of digitization times the level of knowledge equals computability. And yeah, as you say, I mean, it's so much more about human behavior, human health, environments are all getting more and more computable. And
And
then,
comparative outcomes. So everything is like compared to what? So almost everything, so I agree with you. Almost everything I look at is three scenarios, like
Mhm.
status quo, nothing gets worse, happy,
Right.
happy, happy. Somebody makes an investment in resilience, bad thing happens, it's bad, it's more expensive than happy, happy, but it's okay.
Mhm.
Or no investment in resilience, bad thing happens, this is really bad. So you have
Yeah.
to compare those three scenarios. That's hard for most people to do, and it's hard to do
Mhm.
empirically. So the ability
Sure.
to look at these scenarios and do A/B testing or natural experiments, I think, will wind up validating a lot of the return on investment that people are talking about and make it really solid, not just something that's kind of a feels right. Let's go close enough.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of the design principles, and some of the language around the stuff, has to do with, sustainability, resilience, adaptation. And uh, as far as I can tell, people a lot of times use these things interchangeably, What are they useful distinctions? What do they mean to you? How do you think about it?
Mm. I'll talk about ESG and also about those three.
Yeah.
So to me, sustainability, resilience, adaptation are different, largely because I'm looking at an urban lens, I'm looking at a hard infrastructure lens.
Okay.
So it's useful for me thinking of sustainability to think about essentially reducing our carbon footprint, reducing the use of water,
Right.
fewer paper cups. We're going to compost. We're going to not fly on the plane as much. Also, sustainability for me includes the alternative energy sources like photovoltaics, hydro, and wind. Um, so I think of those as things that are really important in an energy transition. I don't tend to look at them because so many other people are already looking at them.
Yeah, I
Now,
gotcha.
so the next part is I'm glad the PV is happening. I'm glad the photovoltaics, I mean, the wind is happening. I'm glad that there's decarbonization of the economy. What are we going to do next? So then need to think about how do we adapt
Right.
to circumstances that may be difficult. And this is where the question of where do you live, what's the peril, what's your time frame, what else is on your priority list
Sure.
matters. And there's sort of a roadmap for how to think about what to do, and I've written pretty extensively about that. Some of that includes making things firmer, harder, resilient. Make it so resilient in the sense of either you firm it up or you make it able to bounce back. So the classic definition of resilience in metallurgy is that the metal can deform and come back to its original shape. So the idea that you can come back somehow is useful to me. And I've talked about 5 R's in thinking about climate adaptation. around aspects of resilience in the physical world. One is to reinforce, one is to restrict, one is to rebound, one is to relocate, and one is to retreat. So the rebound, that would be closest to resilience, is saying we know that our new condominium on Miami Beach might flood, but we're going to put the first floor 6 feet above the high flood level. We're not going to have anything valuable in the basement. We're going to put all the mechanical equipment on the second floor. The flood will come in. There'll be mud and crud for a couple of days. We'll pump it out. We'll get new carpets. We'll rebound. That's a common way to do this. Or you could reinforce. You could say, our condominium in Miami Beach is in the flood path. We are going to build a giant wall, a concrete wall, 10 feet high all the way around. It's going to be ugly as can be, but that will reinforce it and make it totally impermeable. Or that's a difficult way to think about those things. So reinforce, rebound. Another is to restrict. So restrict would be to say, no, we're not going to let you build in that floodplain. We're not going to let you build in that wildfire area. We're not going to let you build in that seismic zone. We're not going to build in that avalanche path, which so in the grand scheme makes all kind of sense. Like, why in the world would you let people build where they're in danger?
Sure.
What if they didn't know they were in danger and they bought the property for some certain price? They have the right to build there. Now, some modeler says, we think you're in danger you didn't know about before. You can't build there, and the value of your land is diminished. Like that's, that's hard to do. Although, as I said before, I don't think the government's ever going to get around to that, except for maybe a few floodplains. But I think that capital is going to get around to that.
Sure.
Then relocate is another one that I think is going to wind up happening. People call this sort of planned migration or planned, basically planned migration. The idea being that over the course of decades, will all the same people be able to stay in the same places in New Orleans and in Bangladesh and in Lagos and in Indonesia? Probably not. So if they have to move on their own after their property is already declined in value, they don't have any money, they have nowhere to go. This is a recipe for chaos. Rich people with good information will do fine, but people with less money and poor information won't.
Sure.
But you can imagine a plan to buy people out while their property still has value and welcome them to somewhere they will migrate to, whether it's in northern Minnesota because there's plenty of fresh water and it's temperate, or whether it's in higher ground in Bangladesh, or whether it's in a new capital in Indonesia, are all sort of up for debate. So there's those various aspects of how do you adapt from a resilience point of view. And the last is around how do you just react. And we talked about that at the beginning. How do you think about responding to fire or rather than sort of harden the asset, make the response better. Which is something that can be done at the city level. You don't need a federal response. It can be at the campus level. If you're the University of Arizona, or if you're Harvard or University of Illinois or someplace with it, or you're in Chicago, so I can talk about the Ohio State. They're in the next state. It's a big campus. How do you think about what to do?
Yeah, no, for sure. So, a lot of the action you've mentioned, and I think and other people have written about as well, is kind of at the city level, right? That the cities are often the innovators or the recipient, either the points of failure or the innovators in this domain. What are some of the opportunities and challenges that they face as they try to finance new infrastructure? And what's going through the back of my mind is I know that when, for example, Chicago sold off its parking meters, some people think it was the most incredible sweetheart deal in a long time that got sold for like $1.2 billion, and apparently the cash flow say the thing it's in perpetuity. That was a minimum of $5 billion. So I mean, those whoever did the buying got a really sweet deal there. How do you think about the issues on financing, not just selling them off?
So to start with, I think that cities are going to wind up addressing these issues much more than states or federal governments, particularly in a big system like the United States or like India or like China, where you have or like Brazil, where you have a lot going on at the federal level. And one of the things that transformed my career was hearing Mike Bloomberg give a speech one day at which he said, "Nations talk, cities act." think, yeah, that's actually right. They do. And you can argue that Vilgaroso or Eric Adams or
Hmm.
the mayors of Paris or the mayors of Sao Paulo have more influence on what happens than their presidents do, largely because the mayors tend to be more accountable. The voters
Yep.
turn them out right away. And because they have lots of opportunity, in addition to financing things, to sort of direct how taxi fleets are bought or how zoning works or how public transit works. Right now, my mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, is working really hard on some of the transit issues because
Hmm.
it's very difficult to imagine a big um, uh, city in the northern U.S. or in Europe functioning with diminished mass transit because you can't. Not everybody
Sure.
can drive. Um, so the financing of those also are things where there's the ability at the city level to share some of the revenue or to think up other ways in which firms are compensated. So a way that's been very successful to think about privatizing of water or transit in particular
Hmm.
is to separate the payment to the privatizer from the tariff paid by the citizen. So it might be, for example, as this happens in San Diego, the Poseidon desalination plant gets
Hmm.
about $2,000 per acre foot of water that they generate, and it's sold to the public before this drought at about half that price. So what makes up the difference? What makes up the difference is the San Diego County Water Authority saying it would cost us even more to do this on our own.
Hmm.
So I've also written about Mexico City, where the variable cost to provide water is maybe 20 um, pesos per liter. The price might be 3, but the privatizer can do it for 30, so can do it for 20. So that's a 17 peso gap, but the government's doing it for 40. So right
Hmm.
now the government is spending 40, getting 3, they're losing 37. If
Right.
they get a privatizer, pay the privatizer 20, now they're at least they're only losing 17.
Sure.
And they decouple the tariff collection from the payment to the vendor, and the vendor has to make certain quality standards. They have to
Sure.
make certain availability standards, and that's really one of the cleanest ways for a government buying services to think about attracting capital into these aspects, because very few of them carry themselves with a tariff that the public's willing to pay.
Sure. Hey, we do have a couple of questions here. One's from Lauren Berdahl. He says, I'm a PPP. I am in public-private partnerships and advise insurers, lenders, equity investors. Future ESG discussions that need to be had today are significantly reorienting around longer-term thinking. Would you agree with my observation that the future viability of public services in a PPP arena need to have adaptability rather than risk transfers at the center of the project setup? Controls, not contracts, as mitigation. The likely uninsurable risk is significant if deals cannot be responding rather than claiming in a changing risk environment.
Yes, I actually do agree with the entire statement. There's two pieces to it. One is around, people are going to think about ESG, or they're going to think about the actual economics of the probability of loss to a hazard. I personally think that the quantifiable impact of some of these resilience measures is going to pretty quickly dwarf the very soft, abstract, subjective measures of ESG that have come under a lot of pressure
Sure.
lately. Um, and then that ties into some of these unknown things going forward. And I'll give an example of, I think, what Warren's talking about. I was talking with a company in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, that does seawater desalination, and they have gas-fired power plants. So gas-fired power plants are air cooled, and if the ambient temperature goes higher and higher and higher, these plants are less and less effective.
Sure.
So who pays for that? It wasn't anticipated in the contract. Is it a force majeure, act of God? Not necessarily. How do you think about mitigating that going forward, or probably having some kind of, I would guess, compensation to the privatizer rather than try to turn to a contract and say you haven't developed what you should. Similarly, seawater desalination in the Gulf is threatened because most of the membranes that filter the water don't work when the incoming water is over 40 degrees C. That's hot, like your blood is 37
Yeah.
degrees C. So imagine you had a contract for seawater desalination, and all of a sudden, because of something way beyond your control, the heating of the intake air, you couldn't deliver on that contract. you would clearly, you'd have to adjust. So what this case is about that I'm writing with this company is, how do you think about those contract adjustments going forward? Because if they just go to court and sue each other because they bring the seawater anymore,
Sure.
it's going to be endless. So I think what Warren's probably getting at is that much of the dispute resolution in successful public-private partnerships assumes there's going to be problems, assumes there's going to be difficulty, and thinks of ways to adjust it by extending the term of the agreement, or providing some other source of income to the vendor or something like that, probably trade it off for a better level of service, a better level of quality. So if I understand the question right, I totally agree with it. And I think there's going to be more and more look at the long-term exposure to these hazards. And it's going to be hard to have a black and white contractually enforceable, gate that clicks one way or the other. Going to have to be ongoing adjustments. So Warren can put in the chat whether I understood his question properly or not. I'm not reading the chat, John, so you have to.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we have one other question. We've only got a couple minutes left here. We've got about 4 minutes to go, and I need a couple minutes to set up for next month. Emmanuel Burba says, what's the role of policy in promoting the development of a healthy building? If left to a pure market dynamic, can the better health consideration alone justify the premium on construction prices?
Hi, Emmanuel. So Emmanuel is from Mauritius. He's one of my students. He's probably sitting in Ethiopia today. So he fed me that question to do it. And I personally think that it'll be driven very much by market demand, and that if there's not market awareness of the health aspect, people don't have their own monitors, or if there's not an ability to pay from the lower income people, they will not be able to drive that as much. I don't think it's going to be driven as much by
policy.
By policy. Yeah, Emmanuel is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School, so of course he thinks that a policy should be the way that this. I said Mauritius. He's from Martinique. I apologize, but. So that's part of the trade-off in my classes when I have students from the government school, because in a sense, of course, plan A is better government that does what it's supposed to do, that taxes us properly, spends where it should spend, thinking in the long view, operating in total consensus. That's actually hard to get there. So if there's not going to be that consensus, that long view, what do we do in the meantime besides just hope that the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus bring consensus?
And you mean Easter Bunny and Santa Claus in a good way. Anyway, the
or unicorns, or go be secular. Say that it's just gonna. It's yes, of course we need better political leadership. Let's stipulate that. In the meantime, what are we going to do?
Yes, absolutely. Hey, just in about 30 seconds, John, what is the most encouraging thing that you see out there to leave us on a upbeat note?
Oh, I think it's the ability of to use some of these things we're talking about around sensors and analytics and capital to invest in things that really do result in measurably better outcomes for everybody. So it's kind of cliche to talk about creating shared value. If you create shared value you can measure, that includes a health metric or a my asset isn't destroyed metric,
yes.
That's beneficial to everybody. Then you can split up a bigger pie. It's cliche, but this is really important, and the tools are there. We haven't talked about anything in the last hour that needs to be invented.
Right.
The tools are all there. The business models need to be figured out.
Wonderful, John. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, I wish we had another couple hours to go through, some of the materials and the things that you're seeing out in the marketplace and exploring it. Thank you for your, good work. It's, you're actually trying to fix the dike, not just, watch the cracks make it happen. So well done. Let me just first take folks through a quick rest of the story. So I was looking for different strange things that are happening, unexpected implications. And it turns out that there's a species of lizard that, as the temperature goes above about 40 C, actually is more prone to change sex spontaneously the way that frogs do. Which I think is, at least for me, an unexpected, unintended consequence. But I think we're just at the beginning of the kinds of new behaviors. And, back to the point that Warren made, I think we're going to have to think about resiliency and adaptability, even in the context of contracts and other things, as shown by our lizard friend here. This is a share and share alike. We believe in the Creative Commons license, so feel free to use this material, and this will be recorded. Happy to share it with your organization or to bring this conversation to your organization. If that's of interest, just reach out to us. Next month, going in another dimension of growth innovators, we're going to be talking to Cosmo Leopold. He's a colleague of mine at Diamond, and he's over in charge of partnerships at Neuro. Neuro is a wonderful autonomous vehicle company that's doing fantastic stuff in the last kind of quarter mile in the community. Their main vehicle is about 1 meter long, about 1 meter high, and about 0.5 meter wide. And he's going to speak to us about, the future of this kind of really to the door autonomous vehicle creation and what kinds of implications it has for societies and for communities. So we look forward to seeing Cosmo. I want to thank the marketing team for all the help. And John, thanks again for being part of this with us, and look forward to seeing you all next month.